All right. So in the frame of simplifying the code with C#10, the file new project templates in Visual Studio have been modified, but probably not modified as much as C#10 actually supports. These are huge from a lines of code perspective. Let me talk about the global usings first. And again, these are not developer level demos that we're doing here. And if you have not heard about anything, just search for online videos for global usings, and you'll find tons of demos, and they're super easy to just test for yourself. It used to be that it has been up to this point, every single one of your code files, you have the same number of using statements at the top: using system dot collections, using blah blah blah. And it was just like you had eight lines of code at the top before you even got to a namespace. Well, most of those now, if you know that you're going to be using if you're using a the note of time library for dates and times instead of the built-ins, which a lot of people do in order to get time zone support that's top notch, then you just do global using note of time, and then you can use it in any code files without having to declare it. So that's huge. That will save you so many lines of code and just visual clutter in absolute every code file you open up. So make sure that your team uses it. You could have one of your developers just go through the code base for an hour one morning and just look at the code files that literally have the same ones, and just promote some of them to global using, and then clean up the rest of the code base. Again, this is a situation where resharper reformatting would just comb through and inspect using statements that are no longer necessary across the entire solution and just fix it for you. All right, the next is the file scope namespaces, so you don't have to indent. This saves you the curly brace at the top, the curly brace at the bottom. Not as huge of a gain, but is still worth doing, and definitely moving forward, you should use those. And so you can put the namespace at the top. C#10 does support just leaving out the namespace and basically inferring the namespace from the directory structure of your code. But you quickly run into a brick wall. You quickly get to a point where the namespaces of what the runtime is kind of guessing and assigning to your code, you want a little bit of control over it. So to dispense with namespaces in the first place, you need to make sure that you're within a scope that's going to be a very, very small program. And of course, we all have programs where there's a batch job, a really small batch job that needs to do something or listen to a single queue when messages come through, do something, call a web service, write record to a database. And it's the tiniest of tiny microservices. And in those cases, implicit namespaces where you don't even declare it, could that be useful? Sure, and you'd be fine. But in our experience, in most cases, we still need to use the namespaces, but file scope namespaces work great, especially when there's very, very few using statements at the top. The namespace line is pretty close to the top. Records being used as structs as well as classes is the next one. .NET 5 came out with support for records. We still haven't seen a lot of widespread guidance in the industry regarding records. At ClearMeasure, we've adopted them pretty rigorously where we can. We have not found any places where we fell off a cliff and were surprised and had to undo the change. But when it comes to our entities, when it comes to classes that are persisted with Entity Framework to a SQL Server database, it appears that records is a great simplification. And I encourage, if you're not familiar with these, I encourage you to develop some records and then compile it, and then decompile the code with .NET Reflector or the built-in Resharper support. Decompile the code so that you can see the actual class that a record class compiles into, because a record is a record class or a record struct. There's no new thing in the .NET runtime called just record. Record is a modifier of a class or a modifier of struct. And ultimately, the object that's in memory that's running when your program is running is either a class or a struct. But if you put the record keyword on there, then the compiler is going to automatically compile get hash code. It's going to automatically compile an equals method for you. It's automatically going to compile a toString method. It's going to automatically compile implicit operators and some explicit operators and conversion and casting operators, where for people who've made the most of the type system with regular entities, you've had to create those by hand. So test those out. Those are, I recommend that you adopt records. And then lambdas have types. That's a neat improvement. If you need it, but it's not going to be a major change for everyone's code base.